our King Content and the Telecom World. A couple of housekeeping matters, and then we'll get right started with the program itself. First, if you have questions, what we'd like you to do is type those questions in using the GoToWebinar control panel, which is located on your screen. We will see those questions and give those to the speakers as we can during the webinar. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, what we'll do is collect those questions and answer them back by email. This webinar will also be available on demand after the webinar, and we invite you to come back and revisit the webinar or share it with your colleagues. Next slide, please. Today's webinar, we're going to focus on the art of integration, picture the possibilities. The webinar is sponsored by the NAB Show, which takes place April 9 to 14, 2011, next month, in Las Vegas. And one special aspect of this year's NAB Show is the Telecom Access Networks Pavilion, which is serving with both conference programming and exhibitions on the floor at the Las Vegas Convention Center during the NAB Show, focusing on the needs of the independent telco industry and their whole ecosystem. So that's one of the themes we're going to be talking about today in this webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about the NAB Show and the Telecom Access Networks Pavilion and Conference a little bit at the end. Next slide, please. So today, we're very fortunate to have two featured speakers with us. My name is Rick Ducey. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at BIA Kelsey, and we're working with the NAB Show and Telecom Access Networks Pavilion to put on the program at the show and also help with the exhibition. And we're delighted today to have a couple of industry veterans to share some insights with us. First, we have Jim Farmer from Enablance, and I'm going to let Joe Savage, our moderator, introduce Jim. Joe is a top executive in the industry. He's got more than 40 years of experience under his belt in broadband access and optical networking. For the past 5 years, Joe served as president of the Fiber to the Home Council North America. That's an association that has devoted itself to accelerating next-generation broadband. Joe began his career in fiber optics back in the 70s, helping to build the first fiber production facility at Western Electric in Norcross, Georgia. Joe is a professional engineer with an MSEE from Georgia Tech. He's also an inventor. He's received patents for high-speed digital transmission cable design and also for methods of avoiding internet congestion in a public switch telephone network. So Joe, let me turn it over to you and allow you to introduce Jim and our webinar today.
Okay, Rick, thanks a lot. And everybody, welcome to the webinar today. It's great to have Jim Farmer talk. He's had a long and fruitful relationship with both Video Access and with King Content, and it'll be great to hear from Jim. I do want to say that we have 60 minutes for this webinar and a very broad brush and large stage to cover. So if any of the topics that come up are of interest to you, I encourage you to come to the conference in April and where it'll be delved into much more deeply. But we'll try and do the best we can here today. And as moderator, I'll be fielding the questions and summarizing and paraphrasing them to Jim as we go along during the presentations and then wrap it up at the end. And with that, I'd like to prepare to turn this over to our main speaker today, Jim Farmer, who is Chief Technology Officer at Enablance Systems. Jim has approximately 90 patents related to cable TV and FTTH systems over his 40-plus year career. He's a Hall of Famer for the Society of Cable Television Engineers, and he is a past president of the IEEE Consumer Electronics Society. So Jim surely knows of what he speaks today. He is also co-author in 2009, the book came out, Broadband Cable Access Networks. And so for really in-depth analysis, this book is available on Amazon.com. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim Farmer, and we can go to the next slide, please.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Rick. When Rick described me as a veteran, I wondered if he was just trying to say old guy. Speaking of old, I do go back a few years in the, well, not in the business, but I was kind of interested in it long before I got into the business. In the mid-1950s, I was a young guy we got our first television set, and then that one didn't work out so well, so Dad managed to trade it for a used RCA that did work out better. We were living in Tampa, and there was only one television station in the area at the time, WSUN. It was a UHF station. Tampa was very unusual in that it got UHF television before it got VHF television. And I spent a long time playing with the test pattern. They transmitted the test pattern during the day, and I think they started broadcasting at about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I spent a long time playing with that test pattern and trying to figure out how to make it better, and wondered how all of this stuff worked. Now, my mother, except for when I was tuning the TV, when I was watching it, my mother always made me sit back a foot for every inch of screen size. Everyone in the family had to do that because it was said that the radiation was going to get you if you sat any closer to the screen than that. Well, it's interesting that after I got into the business, and I had been working at Scientific Atlanta for a number of years, Charlie Rhodes came to work for us. He happens to be one of the true veterans, the true pioneers in television, having built his own first TV as a graduate school project in the late 40s. And he worked for Tektronix for a long time. Then he went after us. He went to work for the Advanced Television Test Center. But anyway, while Charlie was with us at Scientific Atlanta, I asked him one day about that what for every inch of the radiation was going to get you problem that I'd heard so much about. Charlie laughed about that. He said, well, there were a few sets built in the late 40s that had a problem with radiation. But he said by 1950 or so, pretty much everyone had recognized it and had solved the problem. But they let that rumor of the inch for a foot continue, because if you sat much closer to the TV set, you'd realize how bad the pictures were. So they didn't want you to sit too close and realize how bad the pictures were back then. Of course, the TV sets back then had tubes in them. You got to be real good friends with the TV repairman. He would come in every few months with his big tube caddy, look at the picture and say, I think that's a 12AU7, and replace that. And about 80% of the time he was right. About 20% he had to try something else. Or you could pull all of your tubes out if you wanted to do it yourself and go to the drugstore. They had tube testing machines in the drugstores and a supply of tubes for you to buy when you found the bad one. Have the next slide, please. And from the 50s through the 90s, we really made a lot of progress. First, color TV came in. Again, it wasn't very good at first, but it got better with time. Cable TV started getting popular in the mid-70s, I guess. It had been around longer, but just started getting popular then. The first major telecasts on satellite to cable systems was the Thriller from Manila in 1975, the big fight. There were, as I recall, 2 earth stations and 2 cable television systems in the U.S., both big 10-meter dishes, because that's all the FCC would let you do at the time. 2 of them that picked up that fight, but that was kind of considered cable TV's entry into the satellite distribution business, and that's the thing that really made cable TV take off. Of course, about the same time we started getting VCRs. Those of you who are old enough remember the Beta versus VHS format that reigned for a number of years, with VHS finally winning out. We got stereo TV, we got satellite TV, we got pay-per-view and other types of premium services. So a lot of progress through the next several decades after I was tuning WSUN in on that 21-inch RCA. 21 inches, by the way, was the biggest TV they had at the time. Then they came out with these monster 24-inch sets, but we never got one of those, at least not until I moved out of the house. Next slide, please. I like to try to kind of to shape my own thinking, try to cover some of the major events in television with a timeline. Of course, off-air TV started in the late 40s and continues. I cut off this timeline in 2020 because I didn't have a clue what was going to happen later than that. Cable TV from the early 50s, although it was into the 70s before it really got to be a big service. Color TV came in the 50s, but again, it was the 60s before it became dominant. We got direct broadcast satellite TV in the late 90s, and of course now we have fiber to the home TV since the early 00s, let's say. Simultaneously, with all that happening, we got VCRs, and those gave way to DVDs rather quickly. HD TV, of course, is very big now. There was a fight between two formats in high-definition DVD players, too, that the Blu-ray format won just a couple of years ago, in fact. And it was in, 2009, I guess, that analog broadcasting ended in the U.S. We're starting to get 3D television now, so things are moving along. Going back to the involvement of TV on the Internet, ABC World News Now, I'm told, was the first video to be transmitted over the Internet. The term IPTV was coined a year or two later than that. Live webcasts happened in the late 90s, or maybe that was 2000. IPTV over DSL a couple of years after that by Saskatell, I'm told, is the first to do that, and then UVerse, of course, came in later. So a lot of things happening. It's interesting to try to understand how people watch TV these days. If I could have the next slide, please. This is a survey from the Diffusion Group who asked, how do you watch a new TV show? And you can see that the largest percentage of people still watch a new TV show when it's first broadcast, or they record it on their digital video recorders. A much smaller percentage watch a new TV show as an online service, and then a slightly larger percentage than that don't catch it until the rerun. Now, actually, even though I've made my living in television for many years, I find I don't watch that much of it myself. In fact, a number of years ago, when the kids were still at home, I'd had just one of those miserable days at the office when everything went wrong. I came home, it was a Friday night, I came home, I was just dog-tired. My wife and daughters were out shopping, so I said, I'm going to treat myself. I'm going to fix myself a cup of hot tea and sit down and watch this television that I keep working on. It's given me such fits today. I sat down, watched it for about half an hour. I thought, I'm killing myself, and this is what they're doing with it? But I guess that's just my opinion, not necessarily anyone else's opinion. If I could have the next slide. This is a survey from Parks Associates reported in Information Week, fairly recent. Interest in watching the web on TV or TV on the web. I'm not so sure which way I really want to say it. There is a lot of interest in watching TV on the web these days. Consumers are making their own connections through PC and video game consoles. It's getting a lot easier. I set up my first computer to interface with my home theater when a number of years ago. And at the time, I had to jump through quite a few hoops to get it to work. I did get a home theater when we built our new house a few years ago. I told my wife, honey, you know, I've just got to have this thing because I'm in the business, and if I don't have it, I'm not going to experience the things I'm talking about, so I have to have it. At least that was the way I sold it to her anyway. The number of households using web-connected game consoles rose by 64% last year, while the number connecting a PC to a TV rose by 36%. And of course, we've had a lot of web-to-TV devices come out since then, so I suspect that these numbers have accelerated quite a bit since then.
Jim, this is Joe. I can vouch firsthand. I signed up for Roku and got my box and found out that my high-def TV screen is 1080i and the Roku box is only good for 1080p. So I had to send that back, and then I downloaded a Boxy application to my PC and the Boxy application to my iPhone that lets me use that as the remote, only to find that I'm now knee-deep in proxy server relationships before I can get that set up and running. So, more to follow on that.
Yes, and you're correct, Joe. It's still not as easy as it should be, particularly with some of these new devices. I was helping a family member, I think it was one of my sisters, with a computer problem a few years ago, and she said, "What do people do that don't have somebody like you in the family that know this stuff?" I had to admit, I guess that's a problem, because it's still not as simple as it should be in so many cases. And so you're right, it can be kind of confusing at times to set all of this stuff up and get it to work. But I think that is getting better. It's certainly taken time, but it is getting better, and I think we're in the process now of seeing the display of web services on the TV, seeing that move from the geek class like you, Joe, into the mainstream more. I think it's getting easier. We're seeing a lot of TVs coming out these days that have web browsers built in and can connect directly to the internet. There's been a lot of work going on in the last couple of years on getting as much as you can out of the relatively low bitrate pictures that come in on the web, getting as much video quality as possible out of them. And so I think we're going to continue to see that pick up. But where are we now, and how many people are watching TV how? If I could have the next slide. This is a survey that Ericsson did a while back worldwide. Discovered that people spend up to 35% of their leisure time watching some sort of content, either TV or internet content. 93% of the people still watch traditional broadcast TV each week. More than 70% time shift programs each week. I have to admit I was a little bit surprised at that figure because I didn't think PVRs had quite reached that kind of penetration yet, although there's no question they're going up very quickly. More than 50% are using internet-based on-demand video every week, but the on-demand, while it has a very high time share, at least in the count of programs, it has a lower wallet share. I have heard other people say that the time people spend watching internet TV is much less than the time they spend watching broadcast TV. And that may be why there's some problems that the so-called over-the-top video providers, such as Roku, Hulu, Amazon, and gosh, I can't name half the people who do it, even including YouTube, that kind of thing. A lot of those providers are still having trouble with their financial model, and that is causing something of a struggle still, even though they're picking up eyeballs. The financial model, they're struggling with that some, and there are some people who are saying that there'll be more of the over-the-top providers going to a paid model, which could reduce the amount of video that people are watching from the internet. I think it was just a day or two ago that Les Moonves, president of CBS Television, said that the reason he was not supporting the over-the-top people, and I think CBS does not release their content to the over-the-top providers, he said he gets dollars off of his broadcast of a program. He gets pennies off of the internet version of the program. So still some issues there. While it's clearly something that's coming and is getting bigger and bigger, still some financial issues that are yet to be determined just how that's going to work out. If I could have the next slide, please. We've talked for several years about the three-screen experience. Well, it dawned on me, actually it didn't dawn on me, I read this somewhere, that it's now a four-screen experience. So now we've got 4 screens to worry about. You know the TV, the computer, and the cell phone, which are the traditional 3 screen services that people talk about. And now we've added pads, iPads, and their knockoffs. Somebody told me that at the Consumer Electronics Show last January, there were about 300 different pads being demonstrated. Now, not all of those, of course, are going to make it to market, but several of them will. And that's another screen that we're going to have to be concerned about. Well, each of these screens is a different size. Each is a different viewing experience. And each can efficiently use a different size video signal or a file. And there are reasons why we might consider different size files, which translates into different size bit rates for each of these screens. And that's an issue that hasn't really been totally put to bed yet. The TV, of course, wants a big picture. That's the big screen. 56-inch screens are fairly common in my theater. I have a 10-foot screen with a projection system. I'm just bragging now that, like I said, I sold my wife on it because you know, I was in the business. I had to have something like that. Well, in order to have a signal that looks really good on the big screen, you've got to send a lot of information, a lot of bits to that TV. Maybe 12 to 15 megabits per second in MPEG-2 for high definition, and most people will tell you about 8 to 10 megabits per second in MPEG-4 for the kind of picture that people really expect on the big screen if it's to be really good. Now, there's a lot of MPEG-2, probably still more MPEG-2 going to TVs than anything else, and there are some reasons for that. When the digital TV standard, the ATSC standard as we have here in the U.S. and other countries use slightly different standards, when that was finalized, MPEG-2 was the only thing available. Similarly, when cable TV started to take off big, MPEG-2 was the only thing that was available. So there are millions and millions of set-tops out there that can only handle MPEG-2. And to an extent, that's true of satellite also. Now, the broadcasters have the biggest problem moving to something more bit efficient, such as MPEG-4, because those MPEG-2 decoders are in the hands of consumers. And it's a little bit hard to tell a consumer to buy a new TV set when he's just bought one, because all of a sudden he's not going to be able to get the signals he's accustomed to. If he doesn't buy a new one, he's already been through that once. He's not going to put up with it again. Well, moving on down to the other screen sizes, the computer is a bit smaller screen than the TV, but it is viewed up close. And you can get HD screens and HD video cards if you want to. You could probably use the same signal for the computer that you use for the TV, but we have trained people to expect less on the computer, although that may change with internet on the TV. I was down after I had gotten my computer to big screen hookup working. I was down watching one of the program providers one day, and I was monitoring the bit rate that he was sending to me. And I was kind of marveling that it was, it wasn't that great a picture, but considering the bit rate, hey, it wasn't bad. My wife, who is a technophobe first rate, she hates anything having to do with technology. But she walks into the room, takes one look at it. Of course, she's been used to watching high definition on it. She says, ew, that's an awful picture. Where did you get that? So, I don't know, a TV, I think a computer could use the same signal as a TV. In fact, that's what frequently happens now. But there's some issues as to where that's going to go and what the Internet's going to be able to support. That's one place I think that fiber to the home comes in big time, is because fiber to the home can support over-the-top video at the kind of bit rates that does make for high quality, broadcast quality HD if somebody wants to invest that much in transmission.
Jim?
Yes.
This would be a good point. There's kind of two questions that have come up that are related to this. One is the MPEG-2, MPEG-4, and are there any further improvements? What could you expect in the future with compression techniques? Which ties into the second question, was what about the fact that bandwidth caps are being imposed and they're being shrunk down just at the time when we want all this heavy-duty bandwidth and bits for these high-definition pictures?
Well, Joe, how many hours do I have to answer that question?
Okay, everybody, come to the conference.
Yeah, I think you're going to have to come to the conference to get all of the information, but to give you a brief summary, as far as are there any more improvements to be had, yes, there are probably some. In fact, there is a new effort that has been started now that Microsoft is very involved with, and I heard Gary Sullivan from Microsoft speak at a IEEE conference right after the Consumer Electronics Show, and he talked about a new effort that has been started to attempt to do better than MPEG-4, to attempt to deliver the same broadcast quality, hopefully at another halving of the data rate. Now, is that really going to happen, and how long is that going to happen? What's it going to cost? Don't know yet. But yes, the effort has started to do that. And you asked about how that's going to work in a world where people are starting to realize that in some manner they're going to have to cap the number of bits that subscribers use. And again, that's a good question, and it depends on how the cap is done. What I've heard most frequently so far, the philosophy of capping, is that it would be capped at enough bits each month that if you wanted to download, well, a movie just about every night, you probably could do it without hitting that cap. But there are people who apparently are downloading video almost 24 hours a day. I don't know who, but they tell me about 5% of the subscribers consume that many bits. Those are the people who are going to hit the cap. And when they hit the cap, then the most likely scenario is that they would be slowed down in their access for the rest of the month, or they might get a bigger bill. But I think people are a little bit afraid about sending out bills that are bigger than people want. So I think you may find people hitting a cap in the number of bits, and they can get more after that, but it's going to be very slow. In fact, I've heard of some people doing that already. So I don't think it's going to hurt the casual user. Somebody who is going to Netflix and ordering a movie several nights a week is probably not going to see the cap, but somebody who's ordering 2 or 3 movies a day or more probably is going to see a cap, and that could be a bit of a pain. Let's go on and talk about the getting to the smaller screens now. Let's have the next slide if we could, please. Phones have the smallest screens. They have much lower resolution. There's less of the picture you can see. You can't see the kind of sharpness that you can in a TV, and it's much more difficult to send that high-speed data over the air. So typically you generate a much lower bit stream for something the size of a phone. Now, it is interesting. I think it was an iPod or something that Apple had put a output on to drive a TV, and I saw somebody review it one time, and he was very critical of Apple because he said when he took the signal from his, I think it was an iPod, and put it on his TV, it didn't look very good, and he thought that was Apple's fault. Well, to me, he just didn't know what he was talking about, because of course it's not going to look good. It was designed for a 3-inch screen. You put it on a 36-inch screen or whatever he had. No, it's not going to look good. You can't expect that. Now, sending signals to the really small screens has been a bit of a headache for people so far. Some technologies, such as media flow, have already bitten the dust. ATSC has a new standard, though, for sending video to mobile devices. And Gen whatever, 4, 5, Gen X, I don't know what generation of cell phones we're on now, but those are still in the hunt for sending out video signals, or for sending video signals to, I should say. And now we add the pads, smaller screen than computers, but larger than a phone. It's viewed up close. They've got really nice looking screens already, and rumor is that in the next generation they'll get even better. So what kind of signal do we need to send to those? If I could have the next slide, please. I know that some sellers of online video are already offering two sizes when you buy video, a big one for the big file for the TV and the computer, and if you wanted a little one for your phone. So there's already that available. For at least 10 years, maybe more, we've been promised the ability to start watching a program on one screen and move it to another screen partway through. Maybe you start something at home and then you got to go pick up your kid, and or you're going to take a car trip and you want to continue it on your cell phone or whatever. We've been promised that for 10 years or more, but hadn't seen it demonstrated until this year. I'm not convinced how big the market is going to be for that, but then I've been wrong a lot more than I've been right in my career as far as what the market wants. I did see a demo of that this year at the Consumer Electronics Show. It's pretty interesting, so somebody is thinking about it. Somebody is working to commercialize it. I asked him how many file sizes he was going to have to generate for all of the different devices out there. He said, "I'm not sure yet. We're still trying to figure that one out ourselves." But the point is that we have a lot of different devices that are used differently, and we're going to have to figure out how to service all of those devices in some way. If I could have the next slide. That brings me to one of the most important laws in all of telecommunications. It's my law, Farmer's Law. For years I've been trying to establish my fame and fortune with the important law, but it hasn't worked, and I'm getting kind of worried. I'm just not getting the fame and fortune that I deserve for this law. If I could have the next slide. Farmer's Law simply says no matter how much bandwidth you provide, some clown is going to come along with an application that needs more. If you remember back to if you've been around that long, back to, say, the 80s and even the early 90s, when we were using dial-up voice, when I first got on to online access, they had just gone to these marvelously fast 2400 bit per second telephone modems, and people were just amazed at all that speed, and what are you going to do with that? Well, of course, that would be a laughing stock to even try to use a 2400 bit per second modem these days. I wonder if anybody is still using them. I guess there are one or two out there someplace. When cable modems and DSL first came in the, I guess cable modems the last part of the 90s and DSL a couple of years later, and we started moving up to megabits per second, people were saying, what do you need all of that data speed for? Nobody's ever going to use that much. Well, when we got to maybe 25 or 30% penetration of the so-called high-speed data, we found that the applications started getting written that could take advantages of that speed. Before that, there were no applications, and most of us weren't smart enough to think of any applications other than text and maybe very simple pictures, because that's all you could get through a dial-up modem. When we got cable modems and DSL and things got a little bit faster, then when we started getting more we started getting peer-to-peer for the first time. We started getting pictures. We started getting video. We started getting a lot of audio on the internet. And it seemed to take about a 25 or 30% penetration of the new technology before that really took off. But take off it did eventually, as we all know now. If I could have the next slide, please. The end game for everyone, of course, is fiber. And I truly believe this, not just because I'm working in that field, but I truly believe that fiber is the best method we have and will have for a while of getting bits into the home. Each service provider who is doing or contemplating doing fiber has his own timetable for getting there, his own pathway for getting there. It's based on existing plant financial issues and his embedded infrastructure. Telephone companies generally we're seeing go DSL to fiber, although there are some independents who have HFC networks who are going that route, springing off of that route. Fiber to the home by Verizon and a number of independent telcos, fiber to the curb, more with AT&T, where they just go part of the way to the home, and then the last few hundred feet are on twisted pair still. Cable television, I believe, has an existing plant that is better than twisted pair plant, but it's running out of steam too. It's not quite as far down the maturity curve as is twisted pair, which has been with us for over 100 years now. But the coax portion of the HFC plant it's starting to get more difficult. You're probably familiar with the S-curve of progress, where in the beginning you put a lot of work in for a little progress until the technology gets to a certain critical point. Then with just a relatively little bit more input, the services and what you get out of the technology increases a lot. Then near the end of life it slows down a little again. In my opinion, twisted pair is very much into that end of life area where the progress has slowed down quite a bit. HFC cable TV is getting there, but probably not quite as far down that path yet. They've got DOCSIS 3.0, which is giving more bandwidth, but still the bandwidth you can get out of DOCSIS 3.0 pales compared to what you can get out of fiber all the way to the home. Cable TV is also doing analog reclamation, where they are taking off a lot of their analog signals and putting digital on, because they can get about 10 standard definitions in the spectrum where one analog signal goes. They have switched digital video, which I describe as the broadcast version of IPTV. It works very much the same way, and in fact is based on IPTV. I have heard that Comcast, the biggest cable TV operator and a big proponent of switched digital video, has kind of retrenched a little bit on that now. But it is still a technology being used to reclaim bandwidth. RFOG is a new RF-oriented fiber-to-the-home technology. And finally, cable TV is looking at fiber-to-the-home through DPoE. That stands for DOCSIS Protocol over Ethernet. It's an FTTH system, probably EPON, that manages as if it were a DOCSIS system. Munis and independent telephone companies are getting into the FTTH game directly, since they either didn't have plant before or the plant was old. If I could have the next slide, please. And I see Joe's going to be hurrying me along any minute now. Who's building FTTH? Verizon is building FTTH in selected markets with FiOS. I'm sure you've heard of that. Local municipalities, frequently through a utility they own, are building a lot, and I've listed 4 that I happen to know about offhand right here. There are, of course, many others. In a lot of cases, we find that these people are getting into the FTTH business because of the perception that they're not being served well by either their telephone company or their cable TV company. So they decide to do their own. Turns out they've already got a lot of fiber out. They've already been accustomed to operating data networks, so in some cases it's not that much of a leap for them. Independent telephone companies, and again I've listed 4 that I happen to know about right off the top of my head. Independent competitive overbuilders, we are seeing a few people who are overbuilding cable TV plant with a competitive offering using fiber. And we are seeing cable TV people dip their toes into it in one way or the other. Next slide, please. The status of builds, telephone companies, my experience has been, and Verizon and AT&T are an exception to this, but mostly greenfield where they're expanding and where they had old plant that was in need of replacement. One I happen to know about is Columbus, Kansas. Converted their entire city, the telephone company there, converted the entire city, all 1 square mile of it, to FTTH. As far as I know, it was the first all FTTH city in the nation. They've actually pulled out their copper plants altogether now. Of course, Verizon is overbuilding their copper plant. They've slowed down some now, but we think it's temporary while they go back and work on marketing what they've done and pulling the money out of it that they should be getting. And cable TV is just now starting, working that from several angles, probably RFOG for the next few years and then DPOE over that. If I could have the next slide, and I guess I better hurry up here, huh, Joe? The competitive scene, I like to divide video into the broadcast arena and into IPTV. I can further divide each of those into at least 2 categories, and I could probably come up with more if you pressed me to. There's the old, for broadcast, there's the old analog that is no longer broadcast here, but is still carried on cable television to an extent. The reason being that they can go into old TV sets without having to use an expensive set-top. And of course, there's a digital broadcast, which is the thing that's taking over now. In IPTV, I can look at that as a TV service that you provide, and I can look at it as over-the-top video, which is the YouTubes and the Netflix and Hulu and all those other people out there. I've tried to show who is doing what type of technology. Satellite is pretty much restricted to broadcast digital. Cable TV, DSL is restricted to IPTV, and I've kind of taken over the top off to the side for a moment, but a TV service can be offered over DSL, and that's all going to be IPTV. Cable TV can do analog and digital broadcast, and the fact that that oval cuts part of the IPTV service block is not an accident because of the switch digital video, which I mentioned, which is logically the same as IPTV, only over a broadcast plant. And FTTH can do all of those very nicely. Over-the-top video, it depends on who you are. Satellite, you effectively can't do it, although there is a satellite data service special. Cable TV, it's a little bit painful because it uses a good bit of their bandwidth, but it can be done. DSL is very painful because of relatively limited bandwidth in a lot of cases. FTTH is less painful, but there's still a cost associated with it. And I guess since I, as usual, am talking too long, I better skip the next slide. And let's go to the, so where is video going slide, please. And this is one that Joe asked me to put in. Well, as I told Joe, he wanted me to prognosticate what's going to happen with video. And I've had to send my crystal ball out for repairs, and they can't get the parts for it. But basically, I think video is going everywhere. I used to have a boss who liked to say it's not a zero-sum game. And I think that's true. Rarely does a new technology totally displace an old technology, maybe buggy whips being an exception. But if you look back on most of the technologies in the last century, a lot of them are still around. AM radio is over 100 years old. Would it be bigger if all these other choices hadn't come up? Of course, but it's still there and still, I'm told, $1 billion business worldwide. I think in the next few years, every home in metropolitan areas are going to have a choice of at least 2 facilities-based triple-play suppliers for video, voice, and data. I expect to see both IPTV and broadcast both be around for quite a while, as well as off-air broadband. Of course, these off-air broadband, I think, is going to play it's going to play kind of a specialty role, but I expect it to be there. A lot of screens, we're going to have to figure out how to service all of those screens. A lot of personalization of video. People do really want it when and where they want it, and somebody's going to figure out how to do that. I think YouTube and all those other over-the-top people are going to thrive, but I don't see that they're going to replace entertainment TV as we've known it for many, many years. And with that, I think I'm a little bit over time, so Joe, back to you.
Okay, Jim. Well, there's a couple of questions that sort of tie into the future looking. One is, you claim that bandwidth, Farmer's Law implies that it's just going to continue to require more bandwidth to deliver video services. The question was, how much bandwidth will 3D TV require? And then a second, longer term, is when do you anticipate delivery of holographic video services?
Can I answer that second one first?
Okay.
It'll be a while. Actually, that happened millions of years ago. Didn't you see the first Star Wars movie? And that was a long time ago, Joe. So that's happened a long time ago. Trouble is, it happened someplace else in the universe. We've never had a way to figure out how to do it here. As for how much bandwidth 3D TV takes up, very good question. At the absolute maximum, it's going to take up twice the bandwidth of 2D of the same resolution, because I have got to transmit twice the information. Some people say 100 megabits for 3D. No, that's baloney. Worst case, it would be twice, and in practice, I don't think it's going to be that much. Now, the first ways to broadcast, and this is, I'm talking about broadcast where you're transmitting HD. DVD does it slightly different way. But as far as broadcasting, I expect to see people do either what's called side-by-side or over and under, where basically you're robbing half the bandwidth or half the resolution either in the horizontal or vertical axis, so that you can put the other eye's picture in. So that I transmit, let's say, side by side, the left side of the screen, if you were to look at it on a 2D TV, would be the left eye and the right side would be the right eye, both squished up horizontally. If you look at it on a 3D TV, you'd see the 3D picture, but the resolution would be suffering somewhat in one dimension. This is probably the first thing out of the gate. The good news is that it takes up the same bandwidth as a 2D picture, and it will go through all of the existing television infrastructure that's out there. So that's what people like ESPN and I think Discovery are launching or have launched 3D networks. That's what they're doing. The bad news is that because of the way the picture is transmitted, you also have to transmit a separate 2D image. So the 3D image takes the same bandwidth as the 2D image, but you have to transmit both 2D and 3D images. So you're still taking a penalty of one program's worth of bandwidth to transmit 3D. Now, the longer term, it's possible to encode the signal as, let's say, a left eye and the right eye is, you're just encoding the difference between the left and right eye. A lot more computationally intensive on the encoding side. There are no standards yet. The assumption is that you will get out of that a compatible picture. Both 2D and 3D sets will be able to watch the same picture, because the 2D sets will simply ignore the difference information for the second eye. And that will probably be around a 70% is the number I've heard. I would say 50 to 70% bandwidth penalty. So you're better off than the side-by-side overall when you have to transmit both 2D and 3D. It's definitely not the 100 megabits that some people have prognosticated it to be. And it will be all in MPEG-4, so you're looking at 8 to 10 megabits for the best broadcast quality 2D.
Well, Jim, I wish we'd had a diagram for that one, but thanks for the response. And you know, our answer is, if you want more information on this, 2 days worth of submersion into it at the Telecom Access Conference at the NAB Show. Jim, I want to thank you very much for that, and you covered an awful lot of territory and an awful lot of ground, and I think folks have a broad brush perspective now of video services and how they're influenced, and backwardly influenced by the access networks and the screens that they function with. And with that, I'm going to say thanks again, Jim, and turn it over to Rick Ducey to close out the session.
Joe, thank you very much. And Jim, thank you very much also. I want to highlight one or two of the sessions at the conference, and on the slide you can see the URL that will bring you right to the list of all the sessions. But over on the right-hand side in blue on this slide, Eric Presworski from Zone, the Chief Technology Officer at Zone, I think is a nice compliment to Jim, your presentation here. You took a look back and see where video has come from. In Eric's presentation, the keynote address at the Telecom Access Networks conference, he is going to look 25 years ahead. So maybe he'll get into holograms, Joe. But you know, when you're building a telephone network and you're trying to take advantage of business opportunities with video, it's a long-term commitment and a long-term build-out. You really have to have that strategic vision to see where the market's going and where you need to have your network be positioned. So Eric's going to take that up. We have talked about telephone. Another aspect of what's going on, Jim, you mentioned this in your comments, is cable. Well, Stephen Hardy from Lightwave is going to have a panel talking about this from a cable operator's perspective and how they're dealing with what's going on in the telephone world from a competitive perspective and the technology perspective. As you mentioned, Jim, they have some different architectural strategies compared to telephone companies. And then another session I'd like to highlight, we have 12 sessions altogether across the 2 days, but another session I just want to highlight here, we talked a lot about the technology, and of course someone has to pay for this, so we're very fortunate to have Catherine McNaught from Corning to put this together in a technology specific business case. So she puts dollars to the technology and shows this across time. So I think it's kind of a nice set of conference sessions we'll have all together. This is just a few of them. And for those of you who are on the conference, the webinar today, we do have a special feature for you. Down there in the bottom left, save $100 on the registration fee. Just use the promotional code TF27. So with that, if we could have the next slide, I'd just like again to thank our featured speakers, Joe Savage and Jim Farmer. Thank you very much, guys. This conference is co-sponsored by the Fiber to the Home Council. We'll have the current president, Dan O'Connell, as speaker at that conference, and Joe Savage, of course, is immediate past president of Fiber to the Home Council. So NAB Show is very pleased to have such a strong partner for the conference and also helping us out with this webinar. So we will follow up with you all by email. Thank you for being with us. This will be available, the webinar on demand. And one final note is we will have another webinar on March 14th. Featuring, again, Joe as one of our featured speakers. And this time we're going to be talking about network neutrality. And Joe will be speaking with Tom Cohen from Kelly Dry, leading law firm and also general counsel for Fiber to the Home Council. So that will be Monday, March 14 at 2 p.m. Eastern. Hope to see you back then, and we'll send you an email reminder about that. Thanks very much, everybody.
Are we off?